Greetings. My name is Matthew Ehret, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review, the director of the Rising Tide Foundation, and the senior fellow of the American University in Moscow. Over the course of the past decade or so, I've found myself authoring a number of books reconstructing some lost history, which manifested first in a four-volume book series by the title of The Untold History of Canada, which was followed by the four-volume Clash of the Two Americas, of which much of that has been translated into Russian, and is available with though and is available in the Russian markets. I've also published a science book, which was sort of a sequel to the Clash of the Two Americas, called Science Unshackled: Restoring Causality in a World of Chaos, which does much of what I do on the political front by mapping out the origins of the deep state, the shadow governments, the fifth columnists operating within Western governments, in opposition to a more legitimate, authentic tradition, which has stood up in resistance to the oligarchical master-slave structure of society. And I used that same analysis in the scientific domain by reviewing the two opposing traditions that masquerade both, that lay claim to being Western science, although only one of them is authentic and has generated the real creative leaps and breakthroughs that have given rise to the greatest resonance of humankind to the universe that we were born into. The most recent books that I have published is a three-volume book series called The Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Volume 1 to 3, that were published at the same time right before Christmas of 2024. All of these books and the research contained within them will be useful and will be brought into the 10-part series of lectures, well, 9 for now, but maybe 10, that I will be delivering over the coming weeks. The point of my lectures will be to make as transparent as possible my methodologies, both in looking at history, but also at analyzing geopolitically our present current circumstances. And the focus philosophically will always be the future, knowing that, and this is a very important idea that I've held on to for many years, that history, properly understood, is an analysis of futures that failed to come into being, or in other cases that did manifest in varying degrees of amplitude. Conspiracies in that sense are what shapes our history. Intentions about making things happen, ideas about the future that should be brought into being, which manifests in actions, policies, for good or for bad. And that method of thinking of history as shaped by ideas and not simply mechanistic moment-to-moment urges, or simply something driven by ages and social dynamics devoid of ideas and personalities relating to those ideas, is a very important method and aspect of what I have internalized and have used, which I hope to, again, popularize and to persuade those who may be in doubt that this method is viable and actually very effective in the course of these series. So the first presentation I composed a series of slides, which we will begin right now. As I mentioned, this first lecture is called An Introduction to Open versus Closed Systems of Economics. I've selected a picture of the Earth from space featuring a modern expression of technology that we see in the Arab world. Much of it, we see the high rate of technological progress, or a shadow of it, with the electric lights across Europe and also Asia. Africa, not so much. Much of Central Asia is lacking, especially in the East, but that can hopefully change on all fronts sooner than later. Now, one of the important ideas of this Earth-Sun in space image that I want to keep in mind is, if we choose to see the Earth as simply an isolated thing in a vacuum with empty, dark space of cold death around, the concept of the universe becomes one that is perhaps frightening, distant, something that does not awaken more sublime emotions. However, if we choose to look at the this image from the standpoint of our mind's eye and not so much our physical eyes, we have to recognize that this relationship of the earth and the sun, which generates and drives life, weather, and so much else, geological changes and beyond, is also being mediated by electromagnetic fields, the Van Allen belt, and many other uh, varieties of oscillating magnetic fields, cosmic radiation, a dense ocean of cosmic radiation, both saturating our solar system, but also our galaxy more broadly, which itself is being moderated by the magnetic field of the sun, which flips every 11 years, according to pole shifts, that is being moderated or being expressed by the the various sunspots, coronal mass ejections, and various things that we have very little understanding of at this early phase of human evolution. So this interconnected web of electromagnetic fields, cosmic radiation, oscillating currents, and certain forms of periodic activity has a lot to do with not just the Earth Sun, but also the Sun galaxy relationship and the broader galaxy within the yet very little understood constellation of galaxies that we so happen to find ourselves at this moment. In the framework of this lecture series, I'm going to just paint a little picture right now so that people have an idea of what we're going into. The first lecture, this one here, will be on the theoretical framework of either modality of thought in human systems, biological systems, and physics. We're going to look at both the theory of first causes, but also concrete case studies to put some meat on the bones of the theory of both open and closed system paradigms, with a specific geopolitical focus, I believe, for this first one. In the second presentation, I'm going to focus on my particular, more subjective backstory, how I came into this this field of research, my method of analysis. Within that, we will be discussing and we'll review an introduction to Platonic versus Aristotelian methods of analysis. The figure that was very important in my research and development is Lyndon LaRouche, a late American economist and philosopher who will be also introduced in that second lecture. My particular contributions to the study of Canadian and US history, how I made my discoveries, the importance of anomalies, specifically in paradox resolution within a proper method of investigation, the importance of context and the principle of analysis situs, or the geometry of position, as it was developed by Gottfried Leibniz, will also be developed, and some case studies, if we have time, of Canada specifically as a synthetic construct from 1774 until the present. In the third lecture, which will be titled Anti-Entropy as a Fundamental Property of Physical Spacetime, we'll be looking at the evidence of creative life and reasonability built into the fabric of reality. We'll also be introduced to the importance of the golden section's appearance in living nature and where it applies to human life and physical economic considerations. In lecture number 4, which will be titled LaRouche's Science of Physical Economy more broadly, I will ask, why is this important and revolutionary? How did Lyndon LaRouche come to those discoveries of physical economy between the years of 1952 and 1954? What is the measurability of technological progress, energy flux density, and population growth dynamics within LaRouche's system? What is his conception of free energy in his idea of systems analysis, which is very different from the form that we often see promoted in many of the academic institutions, especially here in the West? And this will touch upon the question of dynamic versus mechanistic systems analysis. So we'll be class number 4. Class number 5 will be the importance of reestablishing a connection between classical art and true science. This one will be a little close to my heart, because this is where the real passion of the pursuit of discoveries of knowledge, I believe, really comes from, is found in the domain of culture, primarily, not simply in the domain of abstract ideas per se, or cold logical analysis alone. So within that class, the topics of the creation of a citizenry capable of self-government, i.e. the love of wisdom, pleasures associated with wisdom in the higher senses than simply the pleasures of the flesh will be analyzed, and what type of culture is needed to generate as much as possible sovereign citizens who are animated by the proper uh, considerations of aesthetics when they make moral judgments of both themselves subjectively, but also the broader society objectively in which they exist. The examples, several examples of classical art as animated by reason and beauty, together will be also analyzed. The cultivation of creative reason per se, which was something beyond mere deductive, inductive logic, will be analyzed with, again, many concrete examples. How the arts were undermined by the CIA in the United States' case, which was at the heart of the rise of atonalism, abstract art, contemporary art, and the cult of irrationalism more generally, which really took seed in the Cold War in the West. And finally, that class will end with the topic of how the attack on moral reason and within the arts during the Cold War also undermined scientific creativity and permitted a takeover of our Western institutions by the Club of Rome, cybernetics, and Rand Core type thinking. Lecture number 6 will be titled The Eugenics Roots of Transhumanism, 100 Years to Flatten the Curve. This will deal with Thomas Malthus to Charles Darwin to Francis Galton to Norbert Wiener's cybernetics and even Julian Huxley's transhumanist cult in our modern time. We will be looking at Thomas Huxley's role in shaping the X Club in 1865 and the political, not simply biological, but political usefulness of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Finally, that class will end on an alternative evolutionary system or alternative evolutionary systems, plural, that are not simply trapped by Darwinian axioms and postulates. Class number 7 will deal with the occult roots of empire. Sorry. Within this, we will be discussing and we'll be introduced to mystery cults, ancient pre-Christian through Gnostic heresies that went underground after the Council of Nicaea, their various rebrandings over the ensuing 1800 years unto the current occult underground. We will look at Templars, the Hellfire Club, the Inquisition's role in this game, Jesuits, Anglicanism, Rapture Zionist cult origins, which are also behind many of the trappings currently underway in the Middle East and Middle East dynamics more generally today. We will have another class on the roots of the modern nation state, from Plato's Republic to the 1648 Westphalian system to the U.S. Republic itself, and the fight to save the U.S. Republic from the unresolved issue of the British City of London directed fifth colonists embedded within the U.S., the heart of the U.S., that were never extracted after 1776, which currently plague the world to this very day, and the striving towards a more perfect union and the roots of the deep state sabotage of the better American traditions, which I hope to see revived before calamity strikes humanity. And finally, a class on how the New World Order was stopped will be an important one, I believe, to perhaps end the cycle of lectures on, which will draw heavily from my works, especially on the Clash of the Two Americas, featuring case studies in breaking free of tragedy. We will be looking at Charlemagne's collaboration with Harun al-Rashid and the Muslim dynasties, the Muslim Abbasid dynasty of the 8th to 10th centuries, all the way up through the sabotage of that ecumenical relationship that also involved China, and to a certain degree, the Byzantine Empire, but only to a certain degree, how that was sabotaged through the Crusades. And we're going to look at the League of Nations with 3 case studies of efforts to impose a one world government with a eugenics religion under a League of Nations and the Bank of England onto the world in 1923, 1933, and again in the 1940s, which were aborted. They were stopped, and it's going to be important for our current considerations of the world today in order to learn from how patriots with much greater intelligence than the puppet leaders we find so frequently in the West had during those earlier times in defeating this New World Order agenda. So that's a general outline of what we're going to go through. So without further ado, let's jump into today's presentation on open versus closed systems. As I mentioned, my passion is not so much in logic, but in culture. And one of the most important figures who philosophically influenced me in my method, which I think is going to be important to just keep this open system thinking going, which involves um, looking at how many apparently different fields actually are connected in very important ways when looking at principles. And the figure who I find will be of the greatest use philosophically in this matter will be a poet, a German poet by the name of Friedrich Schiller, who had written an essay, a lecture, but it was turned into an essay called On the Legislations of Lycurgus's Sparta versus Solon's Athens in 1791. And within this essay, where he analyzes the constitutions, the type of the philosophy of law and human nature embedded as axioms within the crafting of the laws of Solon versus Lycurgus in the case of Sparta versus Athens, Schiller has some very interesting points. One of those most important of points is elaborated in the current excerpt that I selected, where he says, in general, we can establish a rule for judging political institutions that they are only good and laudable to the extent that they bring all forces inherent in persons to flourish, the extent that they promote the progress of culture, or at least not hinder it. This rule applies to religious laws as well as to political ones. Both are contemptible if they constrain a power of the human mind, if they impose upon the mind any sort of stagnation. A law, for example, by which at a particular time appeared to it most fitting, such a law were an assault against mankind, and laudable intents of whatever kind were then incapable of justifying it. It were immediately elected against the highest good, against the highest purpose of society. His standard of judging a good law thus as being that which enhances, or at least does not hinder, the natural maturation of powers of mind, of creative reason, is extremely important. And he does not define and limit reason to simply logic. He is a poet, somebody who also was the founder of a school of universal history at Jena University, a lover of the prospect of humankind living as free sovereign individuals capable of primarily being animated and shaped, tempered by the law of nature within each of our hearts if we mature our emotions and our minds together. That type of prospect of a world that would be defined around a conception of brotherhood and cooperation that Schiller devoted his passion to is one that also I hold very closely in my heart, that I hope also you who are listening share in your heart as well. So again, that is an important standard when judging a system or a nation at one time or another, or at one place or another, as being better or worse based on what standard are we selecting? Is it arbitrary or what? And it's certainly not arbitrary with the case of Schiller, although it is, to a certain degree, subjective. In our more recent years, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made a very astute point of observation right after he had made a lot of efforts to integrate the United Nations with the World Economic Forum. That's him with Klaus Schwab right there shaking hands in 2017. But he said very truthfully that he fears that I'll just read it. I fear our world is creeping towards two different sets of economic, trade, financial, and technology rules, two divergent approaches in the development of artificial intelligence, and ultimately two different military and geopolitical strategies. This is a recipe for trouble. It would be far less predictable and far more dangerous than the Cold War. So this is true. What are these two different systems? Though I assume many of those listening have already a very clear idea of that, I will go through that in even hopefully more clarity today. So what are open systems? What are closed systems as I talk about them? So as this slide outlines when comparing open systems versus closed systems. And here we are not talking about open system as George Soros talks about his Open Society Foundation. That is a very different beast. Open systems, scientifically speaking, simply means any system that is defined by not being zero sum. They are non-zero sum. The whole defining the system is thus more than the sum of parts within the system. And again, I could be talking about human systems. I could be talking about cellular systems, nervous systems, an individual organism, or a whole species. I could be talking about a solar system or any system, any whole with which has parts within it that has a function within yet a broader whole. So open systems are not zero sum. The whole, as I said, is thus more than the sum of its parts. The limits to growth within open systems are always present, but they are relative, especially in the case of human economy. Also within human economy, they are win-win cooperation focused. So within human systems, there's always a tendency, if they're truly open system, to be win-win cooperation focused. It doesn't mean competition doesn't have a place. It simply means that competition does not lead in that dance of cooperation and competition. It's cooperation which is the driver. It is multipolar in its application. There are thus multiple centers of gravity. It respects and is capable of allowing differences to coexist, but yet mediated by a higher harmony or higher principle that tempers the various differences, the respective different cultures, different languages, different nations that all can be assumed to be able to play together in a friendly and mature way. There's no need for a one-size-fits-all rule imposed as an ethic onto the system as a whole from a singular unipolar crowd. Closed systems are essentially the total opposite of what I just said. They are zero sum. The whole is thus the sum of its parts. They are, when conceptualizing the limits to growth, those limits are conceptualized as absolute. There's only a limited array of energy contained within those systems, and thus the limits are absolutely limited by the finite quantity of said energy, which will ensure that all systems, like a heat engine or anything, are animated teleologically almost by a future heat death. The system is always inclined to run down, to die, to decay, to have less potential for creative change at any given moment in time. So that's also a very extremely important idea that's imposed by all closed system hypotheses, which also, I guess, implies that death, not life, is the governing principle that we must assume all systems, including human, are animated by. In its political application, it is win-lose competition focused, a race for diminishing returns, as some say. It is unipolar politically, as far as having one singular center of gravity, not multipolar. So to begin, we'll look at some traces of when you're in a closed system. When? What sort of effects or what sort of shadows could we expect to see when we find ourselves locked within the trappings of a closed system? Well, the first thing is we would find certain statements made by policymakers that reflect those made by James Schlesinger in 1960 in his infamous The Political Economy of National Security that shaped much of the future U.S. energy and foreign policy considerations and economic considerations after especially the Trilateral Commission was created and became a dominant force in U.S. governing policy in 1973, which he was a founding member and continued to play a very important role as CIA director, head of the Department of Defense, and head of the Department of Energy during the 1970s. And he continued to play an influential role into the 1980s. And we're going to see some of the disastrous consequence of his actions. But one of the things that I thought jumped out in his writings, sort of his manifesto, was his view of economics as a closed system, where he says philosophically that he imposes his opinion that economics is the science of choice in a world of limited resources. We have gone around the world spreading the gospel of plenty, raising the level of expectations. But in the nature of things, these rising expectations can never be satisfied. We must, in our strategy, we must, in our strategic policy, return to the days before the Industrial Revolution and prepare to fight limited wars. He's, of course, referring to his frustration and disappointment with the prospects of John F. Kennedy's tendency to promote industrial growth, development, and abundance for all former colonialized peoples, which he wishes to end as far as the better foreign policy traditions of the United States. He sees that that is a problem, and that the reality is that we must accept that we live in a world of limited resources, and we must reduce people's expectations to have a better future for their kids, including Americans, which does end up happening. And some of the effects of those policies could be seen, for example, in a number of graphs. One of those being a 2010 graph that I found here that illustrates the collapse of agriculture, the collapse of manufacturing and industry in North America, and the rise of services, financial services, consumer services markets, which we can see going back to the era here, going back to World War II, coming out of World War II, there was a much more equitable distribution of industry, agriculture, and services, whereby industry represented about 40%, even going in up to 1965, of representing 44% of the overall economic output. Agriculture represented a still significant portion by the end of World War II, was about 10%. It did go down as technology increased and the ability to produce more with less also increased. So the need to have human beings necessarily engaged in agriculture decreased, and that's okay. Um, but services were still balanced with agro-industry. Something happened by the end of the 1970s where we see an accelerated decline of industrial aspects of the economy as well as agriculture, while the services sector simply skyrockets. That transformation had a lot to do with what James Schlesinger, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and other members of the David Rockefeller, other members of the Trilateral Commission were doing to change and transform American foreign and domestic policy towards a consumer society, post-industrial model, which was based on limited forever wars, beginning, of course, with what was done under Rockefeller, Kissinger, and especially Zbigniew Brzezinski, at the form of the arc of crisis in the Middle East in the late 70s, and that continued to run a very damaging program, manipulating Shia versus Sunnis, and also funding radicalizing madrasas as within Pakistan, within Afghanistan especially, that would draw in and weaken the Soviet Union, which Zbigniew Brzezinski in later years described as his most proud moment and greatest success, was the creation of what became modern Islamist terrorism in the form of Al-Qaeda and other things that were being funded under Operation Cyclone and other U.S. taxpayer-funded programs that Zbigniew was overseeing. So again, this didn't necessarily benefit Americans, as we could see, and it didn't really create a more stable world. There's actually more enemies that America has today than it did before this began. So who did benefit, and how else do we know that we're in a closed system? So the next slide, you know you're in a closed system, was shaped by LaRouche's triple curve. We're going to go more into this in future courses or classes, but this is a curve that he illustrated in 1995 first, that showcases in a simple but efficient manner how to understand the systemic breakdown that he had forecast many years earlier. And of course, there's three simple factors expressed on that graph, and two functions of rates of change for the positive and for the negative. One is the financial aggregates. The other one is the monetary aggregates. The other one is the physical economic input-output. What LaRouche was outlining here was that since the detachment of the US dollar from the gold reserve, and specifically from the fixed exchange rate that guaranteed that speculators would not be able to create monetary aggregates too unboundedly detached from real considerations of productive value. This all occurred in 1971 under the George Shultz program with Henry Kissinger to float the US dollar onto the floating exchange rates. LaRouche makes the point that that's a very important singularity, a coup d'etat, as one might say, that resulted in the US dollar becoming a thing unto itself as more practices under deregulation, the permission of greater mergers and acquisitions, the creation of greater fictitious financial instruments through speculative practices was made possible, and the monetary supply grew. But more importantly, the financial aggregates, the derivatives contracts grew at an even faster pace. And at the same time, the the core, uh, the most important part of the economy itself, the physical, economic, industrial, agro-industrial output input, was permitted to atrophy, to collapse increasingly, as everyone began to wish to grow the cancer of the money system without realizing that the money only has value if it is in service to the real economy, our ability to both maintain and improve upon infrastructure, to introduce new creative discoveries through R&D investments, and to translate those new discoveries more efficiently into the commercial sector. These were all things that were increasingly forgotten from 1971 unto the present. So this is, again, something we will expand upon more greatly in future installments. Another graph that I find very useful as a consequence of living in a closed system. This is a U.S. graph made by certain contractors within the U.S. Energy and Research Development Administration that outlined in 2012 the failure to achieve commercially viable nuclear fusion. And this looks at the four different scenarios or five scenarios that were entertained by Senate um, experts in the late 1970s on how to achieve fusion, what type of financial resources would be needed to achieve it, either at maximum effective effort or accelerated, that would have achieved it by 1993, aggressive, 1998, moderate, would have perhaps only been achieved by 2005, or the 1978 level of fusion, never. The, the actual funding is shown in the black line at the bottom. The idea was that you needed to supply your scientists with the freedom, but also the financial resources to test their ideas out to see what works, what doesn't. It simply doesn't work on a blackboard. You need to test and build prototypes, accelerators, other types of alternative VPN devices that could work with plasmas, that could look for the least action pathways within plasmas, instead of simply putting all of your eggs into one tokamak basket. All that to say, those resources were consciously not provided, and the actual funding was kept far below the fusion never funding illustrated on the graph. So one could say it's incompetence, or one can say it's criminal incompetence with an intention to fail. And I would say, based on the evidence I have seen, it would be the latter. Even in the conventional nuclear sector, what we see here was a very exuberant growth of commercial nuclear reactors from 1957 in the United States all the way up until the early 1980s. And then something happened whereby the production of new units simply stopped. And what we see from 1985 or 86 to the present has been a general flatline and even a diminishment of active nuclear reactors. We haven't really built anything significant in the past 40 years within the United States. What we have seen, however, is not to be surprised as a cumulative shutdown increase. So reactors have been taken offline, but new builds have not been permitted. Again, the fact that James Schlesinger, running the Department of Energy, played a big role, who called for the need to redefine economics as an adaptation to scarcity and was ideologically in opposition to fusion or even regular fission, is not a coincidence that he and other Malthusians, followers of the ideology of Thomas Malthus, would the fact that they would be the ones making policy and that this would be the outcome is not an accident. This is by design. The last such graph that I've chosen, as far as you know, when you're in a closed system, when is an outline of what happened under the especially Trilateral Commission sabotage of space and NASA specifically, following John F. Kennedy's 1961 speech putting forth the proposition to go to the moon within the decade as a way to reorganize the entire economy and also culture around organizing people's priorities, their sense of value as part of a broader mission that could transcend the limits of the mutual assured destruction of the Cold War. That actually only peaked funding wise in 1965. What we see is in 1965, it reached almost 4.5% of GDP financing NASA. And yet, after 1965, there was a systematic destruction of funding towards NASA every single year, leading to the cancellation of the Apollo programs in 1973, and ultimately the reduction of funding to NASA to below 1% for most of the 1970s, and then even below 0.5%. And with that came a destruction of plans, of goals, of just like fusion power, an ability to carry out and test ideas. So this demoralized the old generation of scientists and engineers who ended up becoming misanthropic, jaded, a retired, fell out of the labor market, died of old age, and increasingly a newer generation of technicians were trained with new methods where they never built anything or very little real things and were utilizing primarily computer modeling without real knowledge. And this has really created a crisis, both in terms of the physical economy, but also within the intellectual domain of an inability to even remember how we once did things. So this is another aspect of the Trilateral Commission sabotage or the imposition of closed systems onto a world that would be expected to go into a state of forever wars for diminishing returns that would be monopolized by certain very controlled organizations like the Seven Sisters that managed much of the OPEC oil, and that would create oil wars and other things like terrorism for geopolitical effects, not for religious or other things, but rather for geopolitical control alone. And this is just an astounding image of a Chicago metro track or something sustaining a very vital railway in the greater Chicago area that carries 34,000 passengers and 70 trains every day. This is the type of decay that has been permitted within Western vital infrastructure, and that's just one typical graph image that I found stood out. But there's many more just like this. And the question is, but is it not the case that representatives of the West celebrate their economic growth? Well, let's explore that. What they're actually celebrating, as I pointed to LaRouche's triple curve earlier, is the purely mathematical monetary aspect of what is considered the economy. And so just looking at the growth of derivatives, here's an outline from 2011. Now, this did not get dealt with. This did not decrease after 2011. This actually increased by a variety of loopholes built into things like the Dodd-Frank Act and other non-regulation that were passed by Obama into that to deal with the systemic crisis of 2008, 2009. So what do you have here is the total measurable over-the-counter derivatives being about $700 trillion. The world GDP, keep in mind, is a little over $80 trillion. So this is nearly 10 times more in magnitude. And a breakdown of various other aspects of the US GDP itself. The GDP itself represents, in the US case, only $15 trillion at that year. And there on the right is a picture of each of the individual banks, with JP Morgan holding about $90 trillion of derivative exposure, Citibank a little under $40 trillion and onward. Canadian banks are similarly, and European banks similarly infected. In China, you cannot grow derivatives this way. You cannot speculate this way because China is one great example of a nation which maintained Glass-Steagall, the separation of commercial from investment banking, which is one of the few nations that was able to maintain that separation, and you would go to jail, as many bankers have, if they tried to speculate with people's money on illegitimate assets that don't even exist as collateralized debt, which is at the heart of much of the growth of derivatives. If we go back to 1992, derivatives only represented about $2 to $3 trillion in total of the general world economy. So the growth from 2002 to 2000 to 1990, sorry, from 1992, that was about $2 to $3 trillion, to 1999, when Glass-Steagall was taken down as one of the last acts in office by President Bill Clinton, it went up to $70 trillion in 1999. That's already a large growth rate, but it was still not unmanageable. But yet, just simply by 8 years later, 9 years later, that 70 trillion went up to 700 trillion. And today I've seen estimates that put the quantity of derivatives currently in society in the system at above $1.4 quadrillion, double what we see on this graph. So that's the type of growth that people celebrate when they talk about an increase of stock market activity in the second quarter of last year or whatever. They're not looking at the real economy. So now let's shift gears and look at the geopolitical effects of closed system thinking. There are obviously numerous hotspots around the world that have manifested as points that could easily degenerate into all-out thermonuclear war feasibly. Ukraine, Eastern Europe has several hotspots that have been increased through activities of the CIA front groups, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, but there are many others. Freedom House being another one, the Republican Institute, the Democracy Institute, and many others have been promoting regime change, color revolutions, but you also have, as mentioned, a direct funding of radical groups, both within the Muslim world, but also within terrorists in Kiev that have received vast patronage and support from Western powers. We see it also in Taiwan, where a sunflower revolution was used to topple a pro-mainland China KMT government in 2015 and installed a much more U.S.-run puppet regime in that same year, which has increasingly become ever more enmeshed in the U.S. military-industrial complex. We have obviously the case of the recently overthrown government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria more generally. Iran is still on the target of being attacked. Taiwan, as I mentioned, Japan is another variation of the Ukraine of the Pacific. Sahel region in Africa has seen a vast inflammation of terrorist activity in recent years, especially since nationalist military leaders have come to power and made an effort to try to restore sovereignty. There has been a backlash to destabilize those governments, like Burkina Faso, Niger, utilizing proxies that are very much tied to Al-Qaeda and very much trained and supported by the Anglo-Zionist faction of government and their proxies. We have the Arctic, which is not yet hot, but it is a very important strategic place that could get hot very soon, according to certain doctrines, which will be discussed in this lecture and in future lectures within this series. For those who haven't seen this, this is a very poignant image of the U.S. military bases. Many are within U.S. territory, but many are international. 70 are in Latin America, more generally, 70 today. We have 150,000 U.S. troops stationed in the Pacific, focusing on China's perimeter. We have bases all over Europe with a full spectrum dominance strategy to try to hold a military monopoly of first strike capability onto China, Russia, increasingly India, and other nominal enemies of the unipolarist faction of the world. I could also say biolabs are also prevalent among this array of Pentagon-controlled systems, of which I've seen an estimate that over 300 exist outside of the U.S. borders themselves, not just in Ukraine and Georgia, but also across Africa. Here's another image of the same thing, featuring the different points of destabilization from Obama's Asia pivot, which has also been growing. After Obama even left, the NATO's ballistic missile shield, the growth of NATO, the burning of the Middle East, and the efforts to again turn Africa inside out. And another image of those nations in Asia who have signed on to military agreements with cooperative agreements with the United States. Now, leaping over the limits to growth, introducing the ABCs of open system economics. We've looked at a lot of the negative. Now, we're going to look at some positive. I'm going to begin here with something a bit more optimistic from President Xi Jinping in 2016 that I thought was philosophically quite deep, where Xi Jinping spoke to a Central Committee conference where he spoke to members of the Politburo and the Chinese Communist Party, and he outlined his philosophy of the coexistence of change and no change. So obviously in all systems, there is the coexistence of both of those principles, change and no change, but which one leads and which one must follow conceptually as we make plans going into the future. And he describes here how coordinated development is the unity of balanced development and imbalanced development. The process from balance to imbalance and then to rebalance is the basic law of development. Balance, you think this is no change of quality. Balance is relative, so that no change is relative, while imbalance is absolute. Emphasizing coordinated development is not pursuing equalitarianism, but giving more importance to equal opportunities and balanced resources allocation. So again, very important for everybody to have in mind in the private and the public sector that the balance must be conceptualized as being relative. The imbalance is constant. It's absolute. It's not the other way around. Or the limits to growth, we could say, the limits to growth of the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity, that is what defines how much we can do to support how many people at a certain quality of life. That boundary condition must be conceptualized as relative. Relative to what? Well, that's what Xi Jinping is talking about. This is the idea of relative to the needs of creativity. How are we going to introduce the imbalance, the qualitative growth that will allow for us to break free of the former limits to our growth, the ignorance that was causing those limits of those new technologies, those new discoveries of the laws of nature that we have not yet discovered, the ignorance of which is causing us to have boundaries, to be forced into systems that have a certain limited carrying capacity. So again, it's just such an important, simple idea in one way, but it's also very much complex in another way and beautiful. Some examples materially of this type of abstract thinking can be seen directly by what China has been able to accomplish. Just, one example being its ability to create transportation corridors. This is simply high-speed rail on the left in 2008, which featured very little, almost no high-speed rail in China as a whole. And on the right is the year 2020, which now involves over 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail that's been built up in a very short period of time. And we're talking rail that can go upwards of 300 or even in some cases 400 kilometers an hour. Astounding. What you have also there on the bottom left is the increase of life expectancy in China from 1850 to 2020. And there's just simply a dramatic growth in recent years, especially since 1980. Really, since 1965, there was a vast spike of life expectancy, which involves how many years you could expect to live, which went from about 45 years of age in 1965 all the way up to 77, 78 years of age, which actually, today I was just reading how this has outpaced the United States, which has fallen down to 76.7 years of age. It lost 2 years since before COVID, whereas China has been able to increase its life expectancy, as has India and as has Russia since Putin has attained power. What we have there on the right-hand side is the per capita GDP. Also, the growth per capita of GDP within China has increased in red. That's a extremely important, that the ability, per capita ability of individuals to participate in the economy in a meaningful way has increased dramatically up until 2018. I should get a more up-to-date graph, but this is still quite dramatic. And on the point of nuclear power, their 5-year plan, their most recent one, expects to have 70 gigawatts of operating nuclear power capacity by 2025. And what we see with these principal scenarios involve an additional 327 built in the ensuing decade, or no, by 2050, I should say. In 2030, there should be an additional 110 on top of the 70 built by 2025 and 180 by 2035. And that's just based on a certain type of extrapolation. We do not know what type of new priorities and acceleration might be forced onto the world with the systemic changes now underway. China, of course, has 48 reactors currently operational and under construction. There is an additional 16, which, as is very important to keep in mind, it's important to compare to the West, which simply stopped building all new reactors back in the early 1980s. So it says something about how we're philosophically thinking about the future and thinking about what our resources going forward. There will be a further presentation on Vladimir Vernadsky, but this is another figure who's extremely important for Russians, but I would say for the entire world. I've read as much that I could find of Vernadsky's works translated into English, and his considerations of nature and physical space-time, as defined by 3 coexistent phase spaces, is of an extremely important thing. It's so important for any type of, I believe, interpretation of our past or our ability to act on our future. And in Vernadsky's, who's in many ways the father of Russian nuclear science, he's the father of a school of biogeochemistry. He was also a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln and the American System School of Political Economy, which his own father was a translator of into Russian during the days of Alexander III. And he was a student of Mendeleev, Dmitry Mendeleev. And in his analysis, he made the point that no natural scientist could make any proper discoveries or appreciate the nature of the universe in which he lives, or she, if we don't realize that those 3 phase spaces are defined by the lithosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere, or it's what could be called the technosphere. The lithosphere being, and there's an image there of simply some rocks, the sphere of atoms and molecules that are not animated, that are whose behavior is shaped by the absence of the principle of life. The biosphere, on the other hand, are carbon atoms, all of the atoms that one could find in the periodic table of elements in different degrees within systems that are animated by the presence of the principle of life, living matter as such, which has certain cycles, inputs, outputs, rates of change that are defined not like rocks, but like living things at themselves, as Vernadsky points out in his book, The Biosphere, written in 1929, is itself shaped by several very important octaves of cosmic radiation, which is being moderated by the Earth's ionosphere, the magnetic fields, the Van Allen belts, which are moderating the varying spectrums of cosmic radiation and electromagnetism more broadly into the film of life of the biosphere spread across the world, but that also infuses itself deep within the Earth in ways that humans have very little understanding, but that drive geological processes that are extremely important and, again, highly underdeveloped as far as our research. And he makes a point that the 3rd coexistent phase space is the noosphere, which is a Greek word for the mind, nuos, the sphere where we find those same atoms, like, for example, those contained within my microphone or within this cup. There's carbon atoms in both, just like in rocks or like within my plant behind me. But of course, those carbon atoms are within the noosphere, animated and shaped by an additional factor of principles of reason, of thought, of discoveries, and everything around us in the rooms that we're sitting in are the fossils, one could say, of discoveries. Many of those discoveries are of people whose names may have been forgotten, but yet who exert an ongoing presence person who discovered clay or enamel creation or discoveries of fire and electricity that were so important for the ability to even have this recorded communication, um, are all components of this growing noosphere. And of course, we know that there are certain forces of the transhumanist variety of ideology that have wished to co opt Vernadsky's idea of the noosphere and use it to justify a much more dictatorial idea of governance by an elite, which doesn't reflect the concepts, moral or philosophical, of those held by the great Vernadsky himself. Vernadsky wrote, as I mentioned, of the biosphere, that it is not simply a domain on the earth within a vacuum or within empty space, but as the image there shows, and as Vernadsky pointed out in his book, The Biosphere, that the biosphere may be regarded as a region of transformers that convert cosmic radiations into active energy in electrical, chemical, mechanical, thermal, and other forms. Radiations from all stars enter the biosphere, but we catch and perceive only an insignificant part of the total. The existence of radiation originating in the most distant regions of the cosmos cannot be doubted. Stars and nebulae are constantly emitting specific radiations, and everything suggests that the penetrating radiation discovered in the upper regions of the atmosphere by Hess originates beyond the limits of the solar system, perhaps in the Milky Way, in nebulae, or in stars. The importance of this will not be clear for some time, but this penetrating cosmic radiation determines the character and mechanism of the biosphere. Extremely forward-thinking idea, and it's the most wonderful elaborate exposition of open system philosophy that is scientifically accurate and useful at the same time. So again, I'm doing this all for a reason in this order. It's not to be detached from what we're about to look at now, which is case studies. We've looked at some of the philosophy of open and closed systems. We've looked at some concrete examples of closed systems. Now let's look at some concrete examples, some case studies of open systems with a look towards, first, the Arctic. The Arctic, by the way, also being very important, especially now that the Canada has put forth a new security doctrine that calls for installing long-range missiles in the Canadian Arctic. Very dangerous because the target would be obviously primarily Russia and secondarily China. It would be part of the broader full-spectrum attack ideology that has been imposed on the growth of NATO, with strategic defense shields built up in Romania and around Russia's southern perimeter, as well as the THAAD missile shield built up in the Pacific, both at China, but also at North Korea and at Russia. This is another component. So we could see a very dangerous race for warfare in the Arctic, or something much more healthy based on open system thinking. Here's a graph that showcases a general outline of the Belt and Road Initiative, or might call the New Silk Road, featuring 4 arteries stretching from China through to Europe, with branches through the Middle East. There are branches through Russia. There's the Mongolian, China, Mongolia, Russia corridor as well, which is underway. Pipelines go with this, new cities go with this, new industrial corridors go with this, but it's very forward thinking, very long term in its perspective, very strategic, because it creates a basis of looking for win-win outcomes in economic activity that benefit both the rich, the poor, business class, the political class alike. Extremely important. There is an Arctic component that was brought into being in 2019 by the Chinese, called the Polar Silk Road, that deals with primarily the Arctic northern corridor, the shipping routes that will increase 5-fold by 2027, unless certain major negative changes are imposed onto the world, of course. But that increased rate of power of shipping, which involves Russia's vast icebreaker fleet, which includes nuclear icebreakers, China's icebreakers, which include three nuclear icebreakers, is an important aspect of the Polar Silk Road, which would cut approximately 10 days of travel time from goods shipped between Europe and China, based upon when compared to the alternative current practice of sending most goods through the Straits of Malacca, through the Taiwan Straits earlier, down around India, and through the Suez Canal. That is a much longer, arduous route. The much more efficient route is in red. It also involves a rail-based component, which involves extending, as we saw above, rail through Mongolia, but also through the Russia Far East, with the opening up of new resources that are abundant but not easily accessible due to the lack of roads and rail in some cases. Now, Russia's much better than the West at developing its Arctic resources, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. Vladimir Putin in 2007 and once again in 2011 made an offer for the West to join with Russia in building the Bering Strait rail connection, a project which was over a century in the making. Tsar Nicholas II had commissioned American engineers to carry out feasibility studies at the Bering Strait back in 1905, which was unfortunately derailed by Western manipulative programs that destabilized Russia at that strategic time that the Trans-Siberian Railway had just been completed in 1905, and resulted in an abandonment of this otherwise very beautiful idea of connecting Russia to America through the Bering Strait and opening up again a new, better, healthier idea of manifest destiny in the Arctic in the north. And Putin said in this Business Insider magazine piece, he basically said that Russia is willing to cover $60 billion to get the project started. That would likely be a tunnel. It would need to involve a U.S. commitment to start developing the continent with Canada. Rail lines between Alberta, British Columbia, and Alaska down to the lower 48 states would need to be done, of course. But it was a challenge for the West to think about restoring a lost industrial paradigm. And again, Obama, before that, Dick Cheney ignored the offers. It was endorsed, however, once more in 2014 by China. The Chinese had endorsed their participation in this development of the Arctic at that time, at the same time that the Belt and Road Initiative was integrated with the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. So again, it was a challenge for the West to find its better lost self. And I say the West because if you look at what was that better lost self, this was a map that was widely circulated in 1890. It was called the Gilpin American Economic Just and Correct Map of the World with a Pacific focus. And this was a map commissioned by an American patriot, the first governor of Colorado, an American Civil War hero who was the governor who largely turned the tide of the Civil War by preventing the Confederates from opening up a Western front. At the same time that Russia was coming in with their battle fleet to basically protect America, the United States, from the intrigues of the French and the British that had supported the Confederate South secessionists and that had a plan to invade Lincoln from the north, where British troops were stationed, and from the south, where French troops were stationed in Mexico. And that was only prevented by the 1862 decision by Alexander II to send the battle fleets to San Francisco and to New York as a message to European powers, saying that this would mean war with Russia. So as this was happening, Gilpin was utilizing Lincoln's greenbacks in Colorado to fund a militia to prevent the opening up of a second front, a Western front, which was successful at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. And after that, he became a global promoter of intercontinental railway systems with a focus on the Bering Strait, fueled and funded by national banks that he documents in his Cosmopolitan Railway, which is available still to be read online. A modern upgrade of this was made public by the Schiller Institute. This is a Schiller Institute created map, first published in an Executive Intelligence Review in 2014, but it basically showcases what Putin had earlier offered for the extension of the Eurasian rail development systems and the Belt and Road into its next phase of potential development through the Bering Strait and a new revitalized pro-industrial North American and South American strategy for building up the real economy under a very different paradigm. There's obviously extensions all across the Middle East. In Canada, this once took the form of something that was led by a figure, a prime minister by the name of John Diefenbaker, and that's him with John F. Kennedy. And the image there is of Frobisher Bay. It is a 1958 study that was conducted under John Diefenbaker to build a new array of science cities under domes that would have living arrangements powered by nuclear power. Probably today we would want to use many small modular reactors to build these types of Arctic cities. The idea was to have the amenities and comfort of Toronto, but in the Arctic, that would also be sustainable for permanent habitation involving recreational centers, malls, entertainment centers, underground tunnels connecting all of the buildings together. Um, and that was unfortunately sabotaged, as I go through in my book on the untold history of Canada, by an array of Rhodes Scholars and Malthusians who had embedded themselves within Canada's secret service, civil service, and undermined Diefenbaker's dream and resulted ultimately in his ouster from government in the same year that President Kennedy was murdered by those very same shadow government forces. But the idea was still and is still very doable. So that's a quick exposition of case studies of open system thinking for the Arctic. I believe also Russia had entertained an idea that was short-lived, but I hope could be brought back under a new and better life in the form of the UMPA science city of the north. I know Sergei Shoigu had not too long ago discussed the plans to build 5 new advanced modern cities in the Russian Arctic and Far East. I think that these would be very much good ideas, both for pure scientific exploration of cosmic radiation that's driving evolution and other forces in geology and in nature, but also for mining industrial activity that could grow immensely under this type of policy. The second open system case study, we're used to seeing very negative stories about the Middle East, will be focusing on the Middle East. We know what the closed system ideology of the Trilateral Commission of Zbigniew Brzezinski has done, taking nations that were very advanced, moving in a very good way towards a better future in the 1970s, and turning them into war zones with no future. Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria have before and after pictures in all of these cases. So we know what closed system thinking looks like and what it does. Again, open system thinking, as far as the type of planning promoted by Xi Jinping, would look very different. Here's one example of something that had been revived. It was originally discussed by former President Bashar al-Assad, known as the 5 C's Grand Strategy, first proposed by Assad in 2004 and again in 2009, where he acquired 7 partner nations who signed on to agreements to jointly build the 5C strategy. It called for connecting all of the 5 major waterways from the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Caspian, Black Sea, and Mediterranean through rail lines, development corridors, with Aleppo being at the apex of this. Tehran would be another apex, and we could see branch off points down deep into Africa through Jordan, through Egypt. And this idea, again, was moving ahead quite well until the Arab Spring was launched by, I would say, what looks to me like the CIA and the Western shadow government that didn't want these sorts of things to happen. It was happening also as Gaddafi was building up his great man-made water project at the same time. And unfortunately, when this was being proposed, Russia and China were not yet strong enough to bring the Eurasian partnership into being. And so these smaller countries were left without the support they needed to withstand the foreign power manipulation, and they were lit on fire. And more recently, we know what happened to Syria, meaning this plan has unfortunately taken a very big hit. However, there are still projects that are tied to the Belt and Road Initiative. There are 20 Arab states that have signed on to Memorandum of Understanding jointly to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the Trans-Arabian Railway, but an array of rail that's been developed in Saudi Arabia. The purple Saudi, what's called the Persian Gulf Red Sea Railway, is currently still under construction. It is high speed. It is a $200 billion railway. It is involved with connecting also Al Jadid to Jeddah, and the Jeddah to Mecca railway has already been built high speed by Chinese construction firms. And this is part of the broader Belt and Road. We have networks that would go easily down into Yemen now that there is a certain peace between Saudi Arabia and Yemen after many years of bloody war. This could feasibly also extend downward very easily and hence down into Ethiopia through Djibouti and the Bab el Mandeb Strait of 28-kilometer gap. An extremely important idea, once more. And northern branches could go through Iraq and be a driving force of a very important reconstruction of the destroyed countries that have suffered so much under Western regime change. Here's a broader image created by the Cradle news magazine featuring both the east-west, one of the important east-west arteries of the Belt and Road Initiative going through Iran to Turkey, but also what we see also is the St. Petersburg to India international north-south transportation corridor that was first proposed in 2002 by India, Russia, and Iran, but which was sabotaged by many years of cataclysmic economic and foreign military adventurism by neoconservative idiots who, well, maybe not idiots because they knew what they were doing and they did prevent this from going forward. However, in the recent years, it has accelerated drastically, and now this multimodal system, which also features ports on the Caspian Sea, the opening up of very important oil and natural gas resources in and around the Caspian, has much greater potential to be actualized. It involves, again, because it's multimodal, different forms of transportation from shipping, but to also rail and roads. It is now active, moving goods back and forth between India and Russia. The efforts to blow up the Caucasus and the Central Asian area, especially around Georgia, was a serious ambition because and also Azerbaijan and Armenia, because it is such an important artery within the international north-south transportation corridor, which is an important part for reconstruction. Some examples as well of greening of the Sinai Peninsula have been put on the books for many years. These are some examples of what this looks like, what this could look like, that would involve desalination plants on the Mediterranean and on the Red Sea that could move water, fresh water, in organized ways with reforestation for creating a greening of this area, which thousands of years ago was lush and green. They call this in the broader area of the Fertile Crescent for a reason, because it was once a harvest, a breadbasket for the world. But unfortunately, through utilizing salination and other things, it became desert. But it can blossom once again if conscious Vernatskian planning is brought to bear. There's also areas of the Loess Plateau on that issue too that I think is important, which was where real terraforming was applied consciously that transformed a dead desert area into a lush green area that it is in 2019, and it continues to be today, that grows food increasingly, and just a replenishment of once rich, but once again rich bioregions. Here's an example of what could be done in Africa. There has been a discussion. An Italian firm recently brought back a discussion that was endorsed by the Congolese government for the Transaqua, a water diversion project that would involve taking about 10% of the water runoff of the Congo River Basin, where flooding happens every year, and moving a fraction of that water into the north through a series of lifts, dams, pumps that would increase water regulation, but also and flooding regulation, but also hydroelectric power for an area that desperately needs electricity, and at the same time, the replenishment of Lake Chad, which currently is nearly empty due to cash cropping of cotton, would be replenished, and the Sahel could be made a breadbasket, and industrial renaissance could really be driven by that. Currently, Ethiopia is the driving force of an industrial growth process in Africa, but that could easily grow. And I mentioned Ethiopia. That's the center of where we have already the building or the finished construction of a portion of a much larger Africa 2063 vision endorsed by the Africa Union, which is centered in Addis Ababa. And that rail that's been finished is the Addis Ababa Djibouti Railway in blue, built with the help of Chinese construction firms, and which, under the current strategy of the Agenda 2063, endorsed by Russia, by China, by every African nation, would call for the building of 6 east-west rail corridors. The first one, the most likely first one to be finished, would be likely the one in green, stretching between Dakar and Senegal down to Djibouti, and that could easily extend into Yemen in the broader Belt and Road Initiative. And then 3 in yellow north-south rail development corridors, stretching all the way down to the Cape Town in South Africa, all the way up into North Africa. So if this were not sabotaged, what an amazing world this could be, reviving the greatest spirit of Pan-Africanism, represented by such figures as Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and other allies of President John F. Kennedy and Charles de Gaulle, as well as Haile Selassie, the great African leader of Ethiopia. And finally, on the issue also of open systems, when it comes to increasing the biosphere, increasing the relationship of the biosphere to the noosphere, there's a recent NASA finding in 2020 that found, surprisingly, that due to the economic activities of principally China and India, the biomass of the Earth has increased by upwards of 10% over 20 years. And so that's no small deal. And the idea of reforestation, I think China's Move South Water North project has been very important, which involves a 50-year actually it's a 30-year program to move the over-flooded areas of the Chinese South, to take some of that water diversion, that water runoff, and channel it northward to begin not only greening a big area of the Gobi Desert, which has already begun, but also, again, create vast hydroelectric power, which China is leading the way. It's not just nuclear, it's not just coal and natural gas, but China is also leading the way in hydroelectric power, while the West, in Europe, in North America, has been spending billions of dollars demolishing our hydroelectric power stations in order to liberate the deserts and liberate the rivers from the shackles of human thought, which is treated as a bad, unnatural thing by the ideologues of the closed system Malthusian school. The mind is treated as unnatural, whereas in Eurasia, we see a greater tendency to see the mind, as Vernadsky saw it, as a natural part of the universe itself. And the mind's ability to transform and improve upon the universe by discovering it and acting accordingly is natural. It is not evidence that we are a cancer or a virus, as many are wont to promote. The final case study that I've chosen for today's first lecture is on space exploration. It is case study number 3. And there what we see is a landing of the Curiosity rover on the left and the Chinese lander on Mars, an image of that. I think it's a 3D rendering. So I would like to begin by simply showcasing John F. Kennedy's 1963 speech. This is a speech that he gave to the United Nations 3 weeks before he was murdered in 1963, where he calls for collaboration between the Russians and the Americans to jointly get over the system of mutual assured destruction and to develop a system that transcends the Cold War by introducing a higher idea of self-interest of win-win cooperation and collaborating on jointly putting a Russian and an American together on the moon. And that idea was very powerful and very scary to John F. Kennedy's enemies, who wished to keep instead the world defined by a Manichaean balance of powers, which was much more easy to manipulate a world of scarcity when that type of framework was the rule of the world. So let's listen to John F. Kennedy's speech.
The United Nations 18th General Assembly, which opened in an unusually hopeful atmosphere, hears a message of interplanetary importance from President Kennedy, who arrives with Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. Mr. Kennedy is welcomed by Secretary General U Thant and American Delegate Dr. Ralph Bunche. He is the first of many chiefs of state who are scheduled to address the Assembly. The probable next is Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia. Mr. Kennedy hails the pause in the Cold War while taking note of Cuba and Berlin. Then he makes a startling proposal.
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this Assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declare that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure?
So as I mentioned, that speech was it resonated around the world. There was a great hope. And as we discovered from Khrushchev's own son in later years, he gave an interview saying that his father would have accepted John F. Kennedy's proposition had JFK not been assassinated. I am not a fan of Khrushchev by any means, but that is an important pragmatic decision that could have changed the entire rules of the world game at that time in a very positive way. There was one last effort that I could see to try to bring this back in the form of the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz mission to collaborate, to showcase what great science could do to bridge unbridgeable political dilemmas like the capitalist-communist divide by showcasing that we're all creatures a species living together within a universe that needs to be discovered, and that we can jointly find joy and prosperity in exploring, discovering, and tapping into those new resources of the mind and of other asteroids and planets together. And even though it was sabotaged, again, it was only permitted for a very short time. It did demonstrate a proof of principle of what could work. But again, the Trilateral Commission was a little bit too powerful at that time to allow this to really breathe. So with President Trump's time in office, his first term, we saw various points that give me a strategic hope or a recovery of the better traditions of America. Again, there are also many traitors, very many dangerous people also around Trump that caused me to be worried. But what I did see in the first term, especially on the issue of space, was extremely important. And here is a picture of American and Russian astronauts in space. This is the Artemis Accords that were first proposed in May of 2020 by President Trump. And it says here that the international cooperation on Artemis is intended not only to bolster space exploration, but to enhance peaceful relationships between nations. Therefore, at the core of the Artemis Accords is the requirements that all activities will be conducted for peaceful purposes per the tenets of the Outer Space Treaty. Of course, this is in reference to the Outer Space Treaty of 1962, which JFK had gotten passed as a resolution at the UN, and that was finally made and turned into a law in 1967. But that didn't have very many details. It was a general treaty calling for all nations who signed it, who ratified it, to not militarize space and to instead treat space as a domain of exploration and cooperation. Very important. And that was re-amplified by the Artemis Accord. This was different from the Space Force. It was not seen as the same thing as Space Force, which is, I believe, a much more dangerous idea for the militarization of space in preparation for an oncoming space-driven war between NATO and its enemies. So that idea was important. Also, within the goals of Artemis, involved the following basic principles, which was the primacy of peaceful purposes. Number 2 was transparency. Number 3 was interoperability of technologies. Number 4 was the emergency assistance between nations would have to be always maintained. Registration of space objects. So you couldn't just send out satellites forever by every little company that exists in every part of the world. There would have to be a registration to be able to map out where the space debris is, because that could also create a lot of damage, could be very dangerous. It already is dangerous. Number 6, the release and sharing of scientific data among nations. So that's also an important aspect of technology transfer and diplomacy. Number 7 was the protecting of heritage sites, such as the Apollo 11 site. I know that there's current discussions about the US having faked Apollo 11. If that's true, we're going to find out soon, because Russia and China will be landing on the moon shortly. So they will, I'm sure, be going to the site to see what's actually there. We'll find out then. Number 8, the development of space resources within the lunar regolith. Lunar regolith being the sand, the material that the moon is made out of, very tiny microscopic shards. But within that, we find all of the resources that humanity would need. Every element on the periodic table is within the lunar regolith, but distributed in a very diluted fashion. So it takes a different paradigm of mining, one that would usually probably involve technologies that we don't yet have commercially available, such as the plasma torch, that would need to be developed and applied for lunar mining, that could transform every element, every bit of regolith into a plasma, and then utilizing the different electromagnetic signatures, the different electron spins unique to each one of those elements and isotopes, we could then filter out what we would like, whether pure silicon or helium-3 or some rare earth, which is also abundant. That could be done utilizing a different type of electromagnetic plasma-driven mining system, not the type that we currently use to simply dig deposits on the Earth. That's not the way it would work on the moon. It could not work that way. Another aspect is the deconfliction of activities. So looking towards space as a basis of creating deconflict, and the orbital debris and spacecraft disposal that I already mentioned is an important aspect of the Artemis goals. Again, very different from the sort of paradigm we see coming out of SpaceX, the militarization aspect of Starlink, and SpaceX more generally, or Space Force, which operates on a different philosophy completely. And Jim Bridenstine, who was a very good man, somebody who was selected by Trump to be his first NASA administrator in 2016. He remained until Biden took office, wrote or stated, and that's him with the former Roscosmos chief, Dmitry Rogozin. He stated that it's a new dawn for space exploration. Today, I am honored to announce the Artemis Accords agreements establishing a shared vision and set of principles for all international partners that join in humanity's return to the moon. We go together. Again, the idea during his administration was having a lunar gateway as another space base that Russia was invited to participate in. Unfortunately, geopolitical affairs have resulted in that no longer being on the table currently, though maybe Trump coming back in may change that dismal situation. but that having a lunar gateway station, what currently China is actually building, is planning to build their own, would be a very important part of a lunar-based economy, incorporating the moon into the Earth economy. You would want to have a way station as an intermediary, as well as more broader stations around the Earth as well, which would welcome many nations and many companies that would be able to utilize this sort of thing. So this is again part of the paradigm that we saw in Trump's first administration. Since 2020, there has been incredibly positive maneuvers between Russia and China, expressing open system thinking on space. The first signed in 2021 an agreement to build an international lunar research station. And in 20, what was this? 20, in June 16th of 2024, there was the ratification for the moon base that would be completed by 2030 and that would have full industrial and mining capabilities built in and performing by 2040. So these are the timelines of Russia, China, other nations are invited to participate, the UAE, India, and others. And that is simply for the moon. That's an artist rendition of one of the ideas and concepts for a lunar colony. Much of the development would have to be under the lunar soil because there is no magnetic field on the moon. I mean, dangerous cosmic radiation does penetrate the topsoil of the Earth, of the moon quite a bit. And if there were a solar flare or dangerous coronal mass ejection, that could cause a lot of damage to life. So the studies I have seen by NASA engineers have looked at developing habitation centers for scientists first, and much of this would be automated. A lot AI would play a very useful role in this dynamic. Would be under the surface in what seem to be lava tubes below the surface of the moon, indicating some more previous, more active geological epoch, perhaps. But we have a lot of discoveries yet to make. Another aspect would be Mars and the development of resources on Mars, the development of first automated systems on Mars would be a component of the extension of the noosphere from the Earth onward deeper into the solar system. Jeremy Beck, who's a science journalist I really respect, wrote a fantastic piece covering the Chinese space philosophy and programs, citing from Professor Ouyang Zhiyuan, who is the chief scientist of the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, who had said, as Jeremy quotes, I'm quoting Jeremy Beck, he has said that the moon is so rich in helium-3, this could solve humanity's energy demand for around 10,000 years at least. While talking about the moon's reserves of iron and other metals, Zhiyuan particularly drew attention to helium-3, which he called an ideal fuel for nuclear fusion power, the next generation of nuclear power. He added, it is estimated that reserves of helium-3 across Earth amount to just 15 tons, while 100 tons of helium-3 will be needed each year if nuclear fusion technology is applied to meet global energy demands. The moon, on the other hand, has reserves estimated at between 1 and 5 million tons. It's probably even more than that, but again, China is in the best position to come to know the answer to the question because they have been the first and yet still only country to land a rover on the far side of the moon successfully, which is where the greatest array of helium-3 deposits have occurred, due simply to the fact that it is a part of the moon not facing the Earth and thus not affected by the Earth's magnetic field, and thus inclined to receive much more of the helium-3 being generated from the sun that has been accumulating over millions of years, ripe for the taking. So again, that would completely transform the type of scarcity-driven energy demands that Henry Kissinger had forced upon the world in the 1970s and restore an idea of breaking through in discoveries of the broader universe on the large, at the same time as we make discoveries of the universe of the microcosm, the geometries and powers contained within the atom and subatomic, I don't want to call them particles, but subatomic behavior of matter per se. And I'll just throw this on for good measure. We are thinking about the existential nature of the species as a cosmic species in the noosphere, as a cosmic force, a transformative causal force of change that is expressed self-consciously within the human willful species, but is already there within the fabric of physical space-time per se, that has infused harmony, purposefulness within creation itself, even before human beings appeared physically onto the scene. And so other animals have disappeared due to cataclysmic activity on the earth, earthquake, ice ages, volcanism, but especially high impact asteroid and comets that have struck the earth periodically throughout our history, resulting in most creatures that have ever existed not living today. Humans appear to have been the only creature ever to have existed that has the capacity to discover the cause of these asteroid impacts periodically slamming into the earth, and at the same time that we understand, to act upon and mitigate the damage, or to completely avoid the damage by applying the type of highly powerful technologies that have currently only been seen in warfare. I'm thinking currently of nuclear fission and fusion. Instead of building hydrogen bombs and nuclear bombs, instead apply that technology towards changing the trajectory of asteroids before they do damage. So this is a Russia Today article in 2011 with Rogozin, still then the head of Roscosmos, making the offer for Western governments to all work together for a strategic defense of Earth, being a little homage to the Strategic Defense Initiative, first proposed by President Reagan. And in 1983, that idea was based on a philosophy, as Reagan had originally said in his 1983 speech to the world, that he wanted and asked the Russians to work with the Americans in jointly developing and jointly controlling this new array of space-based directed energy weapons, electron weapons, to deflect from, well, as Reagan, as the original SDI called for, making nuclear war, any type of nuclear attack from one country to another, strategically impossible by having an array of space-based and ground-based laser, plasma-driven weapons that would render all of those other missiles impotent and obsolete. But again, with the fruits and discoveries along the way that would be made, that would benefit the civilian commercial economy and both nations, Russia and Chinese and American and European and everyone alike. That idea was unfortunately sabotaged by very, very nefarious forces that wished America to be kept as a hegemonic globalist empire. But Rogozin, I think, was a bit of a poet by choosing to call his proposition for an asteroid defense system that would also fold in a defense of humanity and the Earth from asteroids into this new type of technology that would involve new discoveries of new physical principles, as the strategic defense of Earth. Unfortunately, once again, Obama said no. We had no resonance with people whose decisions matter in the West, and it didn't go anywhere. But it's still, I think, a beautiful idea and one that should not be let go of. And finally, just to really make it clear that we're talking about the biogeochemical realities of life in the universe and the mind as a cosmic force of change. We have thus far discovered several important cycles looking at marine fossil diversity, indicating these cataclysms. There's been cycles within biodiversity, within short-lived genera, within the total number of genera per se at any given time, that Fourier analysis has been done and found that we have these 30 million or 32 million cycles, these 32 million and 144 million year cycles. We have smaller cycles as well, that shape just the last 500 million years of life as we know it, from the Precambrian up until our current epoch. So these periodic destructive moments are punctuated with periods of blossoming of new systems that transcend the limits that were binding the older systems, with new things like new mammalian forms of life becoming dominant, whereas formerly they were a secondary or tertiary component of the overall system of the Earth. So within that dynamic, we see that there's it's not balance that's absolute. It's not equality of the system that goes back to square one. We have a whole which is more than the sum of its parts, that's constantly transforming and introducing new principles that have new creative powers with each new system being brought online, out of which the self-aware human species has appeared with certain faculties that the dinosaurs that could not have NASA were not able to do. Or, the dinosaurs couldn't build a James Webb telescope, which has drawn forth images of deep space featuring billions and billions of countless other galaxies far removed from the Milky Way that we have been born into, and that showcase what an amazing universe of discovery remains for our progeny that have yet to be born after us. Um, and here, this is actually from the Hubble telescope, and what was done with the James Webb telescope is a simple black area within this field was selected, and a long exposure was done using the new James Webb telescope over the course of I don't know how many hours or days. And they didn't expect to find what they did, but what was found was that instead of seeing darkness or maybe a couple of new galaxies, there was even more galaxies to be discovered. Um, and some of them have a little bit of a lens distortion, the lensing distortion. And again, it just reminds us that there is so much to this universe to be discovered. And as we discover those properties of the universe at large, what we'll find is that I'll erase that. And as we discover more properties of the universe at large, what we will find is that we will discover more about ourselves along the way. And that aspect of discovering ourself as we discover the objective universe, and as we discover the objective, we equip ourselves to discover the objective universe as we increasingly discover our true self, is, I think, the harmonization of the objective-subjective divide that has kept humanity at war with our true selves for so many eons. And as I round out this presentation, I want to have a quote from a fantastic figure, Yi Pejian, who is the head of the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, who had said philosophically something very beautiful about the idea of Mars. And he says here in a speech to other scientists and students that the universe is an ocean. The moon is the Diaoyu Islands. Mars is the Huangyan Island. If we don't go there now, even though we are capable of doing so, then we will have failed our descendants. And I think, Phil, that Confucian idea of having an obligation to creatively go outside of your limits to growth for the benefit of your descendants, as well as for the health of your own well-being soulfully, is such an important idea that, again, John F. Kennedy had a deeper had tapped into that source in his own strength and in his own philosophy. And we saw this at the best of times, usually at times when American presidents or leaders get killed. We find when we read their writings, we look at the thinking of those people who were courageous enough to both resist the deep state, but at the same time put forth a positive vision for a world that would be founded upon cooperation and natural law. We see a very similar set of principles that is expressed in Ye Pijian's remarks just here. There's something universal which transcends the most beautiful expression of every culture: Orthodox Christian, Catholic, Protestant, every shade of Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism. We see it in the Mahabharata and within the Upanishads, stories of human beings sacrificing their pleasure for the sake of a greater justice that they know needs to be accomplished for the sake of their children and unborn children. We see it in Islam and within Judaism as well. If we're looking for it, it's there. And it's upon that basis that any type of ecumenical, true collaboration amongst diverse cultures that respect each other's diversity while at the same time working towards our common humanity will find fertile soil. So with my final slide, I'd like to end with a remark from none other than Sergei Glaziev, one of the most incredible economists, economic thinkers, and philosophers who I deeply appreciate, and who is featured there next to President Putin. He's a man who had himself studied deeply the thinking of the American philosopher Lyndon LaRouche. He gave a beautiful memorial recently of LaRouche on the anniversary of his birth, expressing his gratitude and his appreciation and understanding of LaRouche's science of physical economy. He's one of the few people I know who have really immersed themselves in a study of true science of physical economy. So I think his remarks in a somewhat recent publication where he called his article "Ideas Rule the World." I think I'll just end it with his remarks. And again, I'm doing this because I think this is just such a great representation from a Russian voice of the ideas that were expressed by the great living Confucian Xi Jinping, of an open system, a healthy type of natural law open system. And he says here, ideas rule the world, and no society, no state can do without ideology. When the absence of ideology is declared, it means the power of money. Because of the declared lack of ideology in the state and society is the recognition that they do not have a single system of values. They do not have goals of general development, which above all are private and clan interests. The absence of ideology is a kind of disguise of ultra-liberal libertarian ideology, where the main thing is the interest of profit, greed. And as historical experience shows, such a society and such a state will inevitably crumble, because they will plunge into the abyss of private and class antagonisms. When they forbade us to have an ideology, he's here speaking about the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of perestroika. He said when they, the West, forbade us to have an ideology, they cited the United States as an example. They say there is an ideology that is understandable to the average person. A house with a lawn, a car, etc. It was, of course, a simple announcement to the point of primitivism, because the real ideology that the American ruling class unwaveringly pursues is the ideology of world domination. This is the idea of creating a global oligarchy that will rule the entire world and, in fact, exploit all of humanity, relying on the monopolistic manipulation of world capital. Within the framework of this coordinated system, Russia can only be a country of slaves. At a more technological level than in Hitler's Third Reich, with birth control, with movement control, with opinion control, etc. And the question of what kind of ideology our country needs is hard to answer. Russian society is so divided that many social groups have directly opposing views on this issue. Therefore, one can now attempt to formulate only the most general principles of such an ideology. And this is where it gets very important. He's showcasing the problem, but here's his, I think, elegant solution. It's in the domain of principle, not an ideology. He says the theory of long-term economic development, which I am currently pursuing, shows that as human society develops, limits to growth appear. Periods of stagnation and threats to the development of humanity's very existence appear, which must be overcome. Principle of overcoming these limits, difficulties, threats, fighting for something new, positive, creating new opportunities for the development not only of Russia, but of all humanity. This, I believe, is the key principle of ideology that lies in the depths of the Russian character. And I think that Glaziev here was speaking not just for the Russians, he was speaking universally for all humankind who are morally fit to survive. Is that what the constant that shapes all of the diverse change when thinking philosophically about what is going to shape our system, that we willfully allow freely to shape our system in a higher obedience to a law, is that law of the universe demands progress. It demands that for us to be our true nature means that we must embrace our nature as problem solvers, creative, poetic, discoverers of the law, the hidden laws of nature, of God's law, and thus become more happy, more self-aware, more tapped into our creative powers, and thus more in resonance with the laws of creation itself. And that attunement, that harmonization, I think is a good way to temper our considerations of economics, of policymaking, of military defense strategies. And I think that is already, to a certain degree, that is very important, being done by many of those leaders of Eurasia currently. And I believe and I hope that we must rediscover that here within ourselves, within the West, before a great calamity strikes and a new dark age is brought into this world that could reduce world populations down to less than 1 billion in turmoil, anarchy, and knowledge that we currently have will be forgotten for many generations of hell on earth if we don't learn this lesson now. So, thank you very much for joining me for this first presentation. I hope you enjoy also or are inspired to read my book on the Clash of the Two Americas and other books that I've written. And I look forward to joining you once more for our further lectures in this series.